Welcome to the beginning of one of humanity's oldest and most enduring civilizations, ancient Egypt. Long before the pyramids, before the pharaohs and their golden tombs, there was the river Nile. Stretching more than 4,000 miles from the highlands of Africa to the Mediterranean Sea, the Nile was the lifeline of a land surrounded by desert. Each year, the river would rise with the summer floods, covering the valley with a layer of rich, dark soil. When the waters retreated, fields of wheat and barley would spring to life, providing food, stability, and a rhythm that shaped Egyptian society for thousands of years. It was along these fertile banks that small communities first appeared, people who learned to farm, to trade, and eventually, to organize themselves into the world's first unified state. In this story, we'll explore how the Nile's cycles of abundance and scarcity gave birth to a civilization that would define human culture, religion, and art for millennia. This is the dawn of Egypt, the moment when nature and humanity began their eternal conversation. The story of Egypt begins not with a king or a monument, but with a river, a long, patient artery of water that carried life through an ocean of desert. The Nile, flowing northward from the highlands of Central Africa to the Mediterranean Sea, is the world's longest river. Yet its true greatness lies not in its length, but in the civilization it sustained for over 5,000 years. To the ancient Egyptians, the Nile was more than a river. It was the heartbeat of existence. Without it, there would have been only sand and silence. With it, there was life, rhythm, and renewal. Each year, the floodwaters would rise during the summer months, spilling across the plains and turning the arid valley into a patchwork of shimmering lakes. When the waters receded, they left behind a layer of rich, dark silt, fertile soil that could yield abundant harvests of wheat, barley, flax, and papyrus. This annual cycle of flood and retreat shaped not only the economy of Egypt but also its soul. It gave birth to the Egyptian calendar, divided into 3 seasons: Ake, the season of inundation; Parait, the season of growth; and Shimu, the season of harvest. Each phase of the year followed the movement of the river, tying human activity to the pulse of nature. Farmers learned to wait for the floods, to plant with precision, and to store grain for the months when the land dried once more. Geography played a quiet but decisive role in Egypt's stability. The narrow ribbon of fertile land stretched like a green thread through 2 seas of golden sand, the western desert and the eastern desert. These vast, inhospitable regions acted as natural fortresses, protecting the people of the Nile from many outside threats. Unlike Mesopotamia, where fertile plains invited waves of conquest, Egypt's isolation allowed its culture to flourish in remarkable continuity. Over centuries, this geography nurtured a sense of permanence, balance, and divine order, values that would become central to the Egyptian worldview. The Nile Valley itself formed a long corridor of life, hemmed in by cliffs and plateaus that shimmered under the sun. Along its banks, palm trees swayed, and papyrus reeds whispered in the wind. Villages arose wherever the floodwaters reached, small clusters of mud brick homes built on higher ground to avoid the annual inundation. People lived in harmony with the land, their days marked by the rising and setting of the sun, their livelihoods tied to the soil beneath their feet and the water that flowed beside them. The river not only fed the people but also connected them. It served as Egypt's natural highway, carrying boats filled with grain, pottery, stone, and fish. The gentle current flowed north, while the steady winds from the Mediterranean blew south, allowing travel and trade in both directions. This dual movement made the Nile a living symbol of unity, a pathway that bound distant communities together long before Egypt became a single kingdom. In time, people learned to read the moods of the river, to predict its rise and fall, to record its patterns, and to celebrate its generosity through ritual and prayer. They believed the gods controlled its flooding, especially the god Happy, often depicted as a plump, blue-skinned figure symbolizing abundance. To honor Happy was to honor life itself. Festivals greeted the first signs of the inundation, and songs of gratitude echoed across the fields when the waters returned. The Nile, in all its constancy and mystery, became the model for Egyptian order, steady, balanced, and cyclical. Its floods were not feared as disasters but welcomed as renewal. Its calm surface reflected the heavens, while its depths carried the promise of rebirth. Out of this bond between land and water grew not only crops and cities but an enduring belief that the universe itself was sustained by the same rhythm of death, renewal, and eternal balance. As the centuries unfolded, the Nile's influence deepened, shaping not only how the Egyptians lived, but how they thought and dreamed. To them, the river was not merely a source of water. It was the divine thread that stitched together earth and heaven. Its flooding marked the rhythm of creation itself, a living symbol of rebirth that mirrored the sun's journey across the sky and the soul's passage through eternity. From this deep connection emerged the Egyptian sense of Ma'at, the principle of balance, order, and harmony that governed both the natural world and human society. The unchanging flow of the river taught the Egyptians that life was sustained by cycles, not by chaos. To live rightly was to live in accordance with Ma'at, to respect the order of the world, to give thanks for what the river offered, and to act with fairness and truth in daily life. In the eyes of the early Egyptians, the Nile divided their world into two contrasting but complementary realms, the Black Land and the Red Land. The Black Land, or Kemet, referred to the fertile soil deposited by the flood, dark, rich, and life-giving. Here, the people sowed their fields, built their homes, and raised their families. The Red Land, or Dishret, stretched endlessly beyond the reach of the waters, a world of sand, heat, and silence. It was both a barrier and a mystery, the realm of the sun's death, of hidden tombs, and of the spirits of the dead. This division between life and desolation, between green and gold, shaped the Egyptian imagination. They saw in it a reflection of the cosmic balance, life emerging from death, fertility born from emptiness. Just as the river carved its course through barren stone, so too did order arise from chaos. The Egyptians believed that if the Nile ever failed to flood, the balance of Ma'at itself would be threatened, and the world would slip into disorder. Every year, as the waters began to rise, families watched the horizon for signs of the approaching flood. They built simple markers along the riverbanks to measure its height. Later, the priests developed the Nilometer, a stone staircase carved with measurements to track the river's level. If the flood was too low, famine would follow. If too high, destruction. The priest's task was to interpret these signs and announce the will of the gods, a sacred duty that linked religion to the very cycles of nature. In the quiet hours of the evening, as the river glowed with the light of the setting sun, the people of the Nile must have felt a deep sense of connection to something greater than themselves. The water that nourished their crops was the same water that flowed past their ancestors' graves and into the sea, carrying the memory of all who had come before. The Nile was, in a sense, the world's first historian, recording the passage of time not in words, but in its eternal, unbroken journey. The river's influence also reached into art and symbolism. In temple carvings and tomb paintings, the Nile often appeared as a god whose arms embraced the land, whose bounty fed both the living and the dead. Fish, lotus flowers, and papyrus stalks, all gifts of the river, became sacred symbols. The blue-green hues that colored Egyptian art reflected the fertile waters and lush vegetation that framed the Nile's edge. Even the orientation of temples and tombs followed the flow of the river, The West Bank, where the sun set, became the land of the dead. The East Bank, where it rose, was the land of the living. Thus, geography became theology. The Egyptians did not separate nature from the divine. They found the divine in nature itself. To understand the Nile was to understand the gods, and to honor the river was to honor life. In time, this reverence would inspire feats of engineering and faith, canals, dikes, and irrigation systems that tamed the floods and extended Egypt's prosperity. Yet even as their power over the land grew, the Egyptians never lost their sense of humility before the river. It was, to them, both mother and judge, generous, but deserving of respect. The Nile had given them the gift of stability in a world otherwise uncertain. It had taught them the wisdom of patience, the value of order, and the promise of renewal. From its waters would rise the first kings, the first temples, and the first written words of a civilization that would endure for thousands of years. Egypt's greatness began not with conquest or invention, but with the simple act of listening to the river, and learning how to live within its rhythm. Long before the first pyramid touched the sky, before the word pharaoh ever echoed through the temples, the land of Egypt was home to scattered communities of farmers, hunters, and craftsmen who lived in quiet harmony with the Nile. Their names are lost to us, but the traces of their lives remain. Fragments of pottery, beads of stone, carved bones, and the faint outlines of homes long swallowed by the desert. These were the people who laid the foundation of what would become ancient Egypt. Archaeologists call this era the pre-dynastic period, a time stretching roughly from 6000 to 3100 BCE. It was a period without kings, without written language, and without monumental architecture. Yet it was here that Egyptian civilization began to take shape. The first agricultural villages formed along the fertile edges of the Nile, taking advantage of the river's floods and the black soil it left behind. These early settlers learned to cultivate wheat, barley, flax, and lentils. They domesticated animals, cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs, creating a steady food supply that allowed them to settle permanently. Over time, small communities grew into organized villages. Each had its own identity, its own style of pottery, and its own traditions. The people of the Fayum Basin in the north built circular huts from reeds and mud, storing grain in large clay jars buried in the earth. Farther south, in the Badarian culture, around 4400 to 4000 BCE, artisans began to create some of the earliest fine pottery in human history. Smooth, red-brown vessels polished to a high sheen and decorated with delicate black rims. These were not mere tools of survival. They were expressions of beauty and skill, showing a people who already valued artistry and form. The Badarians buried their dead with care, often in shallow oval graves facing west, toward the land of the setting sun, the symbolic direction of death and the afterlife. Beside the bodies, they placed offerings: food, personal ornaments, flint tools, and small figurines carved from ivory or stone. Even at this early stage, the Egyptians showed an awareness of continuity, the belief that life did not end with death, but simply changed its form. As centuries passed, the Badarian culture gave way to the Naqada period, named after a site in Upper Egypt where rich cemeteries and settlements were discovered. The Naqada culture unfolded in several phases: Naqada 1, 2, and 3, each marking new steps in social and technological development. By 3800 BCE, Naqada communities had expanded trade networks that stretched far beyond the Nile Valley. Copper from Sinai, gold from Nubia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and cedar wood from Lebanon all found their way into Egypt. Trade was more than an exchange of goods. It was an exchange of ideas. The growing wealth and interaction fostered innovation. The people began crafting tools from copper, weaving finer linen from flax, and building sturdier houses with wooden frames. They adorned themselves with jewelry, beads of turquoise, carnelian, and shells from the Red Sea, symbols not only of beauty but of connection to a wider world. In these small but thriving communities, social organization began to take root. Certain individuals, perhaps the heads of families or the most skilled craftsmen, gained influence. Some graves became larger and more elaborate, indicating emerging social hierarchies. Wealth was still modest, but differences were beginning to appear. This was the dawn of leadership, not yet kingship, but a step toward it. Art also evolved during this time. Pottery from the Naqada II phase reveals intricate painted scenes. Boats sailing on the Nile, animals walking in procession, and even stylized human figures. These motifs are not random decoration. They are early attempts to represent the world, to impose meaning and order upon it. The boats, in particular, would later become powerful symbols of life, death, and the journey to eternity, themes that would echo throughout Egyptian history. Religion, too, began to find form. Although no written prayers or myths survive from the pre-dynastic era, the evidence of belief is everywhere. Animal figures carved from ivory, falcons, bulls, crocodiles, and serpents may represent early gods or protective spirits. The veneration of certain animals foreshadowed the great pantheon that would come later. Horus, the falcon god of the sky; Hathor, the cow goddess of motherhood; Sobuk, the crocodile god of the river. Even the earliest people of Egypt looked to nature to understand the divine. By around 3500 BCE, Egypt had entered a new phase of complexity. Settlements grew larger, trade became more organized, and cultural differences between Upper Egypt, the south, and Lower Egypt, the north, became more distinct. In the south, centered around Naqada and Hierakonpolis, people built larger structures, possibly communal or ritual in purpose. Clay figurines depict leaders with elaborate hairstyles and staffs of authority, early symbols of power and order. Meanwhile, in the north, communities near the delta continued to thrive on fishing, farming, and trade with the Mediterranean. Yet the evidence suggests that Upper Egypt began to gain an advantage, perhaps due to better access to trade routes or stronger leadership. This growing strength would eventually lead to unification, but that lay still in the distant horizon. The people of the pre-dynastic Nile were not yet builders of empires, but they were creators in the truest sense. They crafted the patterns of life, agriculture, religion, artistry, and social order that would endure for millennia. When we look at their pottery, their burials, and their art, we are not seeing primitive beginnings, but the early verses of a civilization that already understood beauty, purpose, and the rhythm of the world. As Egypt's early cultures matured, a subtle transformation began to unfold, a quiet but unstoppable movement toward complexity, toward unity, and ultimately, toward civilization. What had begun as small, self-sufficient villages along the river slowly evolved into regional centers, each developing distinct customs, symbols, and political structures. By the late Naqada II period, around 3400 BCE, the landscape of the Nile Valley had changed dramatically. Settlements grew larger with planned layouts and specialized workshops. Craftsmen no longer worked solely for survival. They produced goods for trade, prestige, and ritual. Potters perfected their techniques. Sculptors carved figures with deliberate elegance. And jewelers worked copper and gold with precision that astonishes even today. One of the most remarkable sites from this era is Hierakonpolis, known to the ancient Egyptians as Nekhen. Located in Upper Egypt, it was one of the most important pre-dynastic cities, a thriving center of trade, craftsmanship, and religious life. Excavations there have revealed large ceremonial buildings, decorated pottery, and wall paintings that predate the invention of writing. In one of these murals, a ruler is depicted wearing a white crown, striking down his enemies, a scene that would later become a hallmark of pharaonic art. It is here, perhaps, that the idea of kingship first took visual form. Nearby, massive communal structures suggest the beginnings of organized labor, coordinated efforts that foreshadowed the monumental construction projects of later dynasties. Evidence of breweries, kilns, and workshops points to a bustling economy sustained by craft specialization and centralized authority. Hierakonpolis was no longer just a village. It was the seed of a city. The growing prosperity and competition among these emerging centers fostered innovation but also rivalry. Chiefdoms arose, local rulers who controlled surrounding villages, collected tribute, and commanded loyalty. Archaeologists can trace their presence through increasingly elaborate graves and symbols of power. In some burials, leaders were accompanied by weapons, jewelry, and even sacrificed servants or animals. Displays of status and authority that hint at early forms of hierarchy and organized rule. This pattern repeated itself along the Nile. In the north, near the delta, communities developed their own distinctive traditions, often influenced by contact with the Mediterranean world. They built with lighter materials suited to the marshy land and cultivated crops suited to the delta's unique environment. In the south, the people of Upper Egypt, with easier access to trade routes leading into Nubia and the eastern deserts, grew wealthier and more ambitious. Over time, these differences would lead to the political and cultural division of Egypt into two regions, Upper and Lower Egypt, each with its own identity, crown, and patron deities. Religion continued to evolve in step with these changes. The gods of the pre-dynastic world were still local, protective spirits tied to specific towns or natural features, but their power and symbolism began to expand. In Hierakonpolis, the falcon became the symbol of a sky deity, later known as Horus, the divine protector of kingship. In the delta, the cobra goddess Wadjet represented sovereignty and protection. Other sacred animals, bulls, crocodiles, and cats, embodied strength, fertility, and grace. These early cults would form the spiritual foundation of the complex pantheon that emerged under the pharaohs. The same period witnessed the rise of early artistic conventions that would define Egyptian art for millennia. Figures were shown in composite view, heads and legs in profile, torsos facing forward, not as they appeared in life, but as they were understood in essence. This symbolic approach reflected a belief that art was not imitation but communication, a sacred language through which humans could speak to eternity. Burial customs also grew more elaborate. The Naqada III period, circa 3200 to 3100 BCE, saw the appearance of large rectangular tombs made of mud brick, early prototypes of the mastabas used by later kings. These structures were often divided into chambers for offerings and grave goods, carefully arranged to accompany the deceased into the next life. Objects of daily use, pottery, tools, cosmetics, and jewelry, were placed beside the body, reflecting both affection and belief. Death, to the Egyptians, was not an end but a continuation, a journey that mirrored the setting of the sun and the rising of the stars. At the same time, new symbols of authority appeared. Ceremonial palettes, carved from stone and often decorated with scenes of conquest and ritual. These were not practical tools for grinding pigments but sacred emblems of power. Among them, the most famous is the Narmer palette, discovered at Hierakonpolis. It depicts a ruler, perhaps the legendary King Narmer, wearing both the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt. In his raised hand, he holds a mace, poised to strike a defeated enemy. This image, carved more than 5,000 years ago, is one of the earliest visual records of political unification. the moment when the two lands became one. The Narmer palette stands at the threshold between prehistory and history, between the world of the village and the world of the state. It marks the culmination of a long process that began centuries earlier, when simple farmers first settled along the Nile. Their ingenuity and cooperation turned wilderness into farmland. Their belief in order and balance created the moral framework of Egyptian thought. Through patience, observation, and faith, they transformed survival into civilization. It is easy, in looking back, to imagine that this transformation was inevitable. Yet it was not. It required countless generations, men and women whose names we will never know, to build the foundations of a stable society. They learned how to manage the floods, how to store grain, how to craft and trade and govern. They developed a shared language of symbols, a shared rhythm of life, and a shared reverence for the world around them. When the first kings finally rose, they inherited not an empty land, but a mature culture, rich in art, faith, and wisdom. The people before the pharaohs had already written, in clay and stone, the prelude to Egypt's story. The pyramids, temples, and hieroglyphs that would come later were built upon their quiet legacy. They were the anonymous architects of Egypt's soul, the ones who turned a river into a nation, a landscape into a symbol, and existence itself into a search for eternal harmony. Their voices are gone, yet their presence endures in every grain of sand, in every painted vessel, in every burial mound along the Nile. Long before the kings, before the gods took form in temples of stone, these early people had already discovered the secret that would define Egypt forever. That life, like the river, is eternal, and that from patience and order, greatness flows. By the dawn of the third millennium before the Common Era, Egypt was no longer a landscape of isolated villages and regional chiefs. The quiet hum of early life along the Nile had grown into something larger, more intricate. A society that stretched for hundreds of miles, bound together by trade, faith, and a shared rhythm of existence. Yet it was still a land divided. To the south, where the river cut through narrow valleys bordered by cliffs of golden limestone, lay Upper Egypt, the long, slender ribbon of fertile land that followed the Nile from the first cataract near modern Aswan northward toward the bend at Memphis. Life here was shaped by the closeness of the desert. The fields were narrow, the settlements compact, and the people resilient. They were builders, traders, and hunters, accustomed to the challenges of a land where every drop of water mattered. To the north lay Lower Egypt, the wide, fan-shaped delta that opened like a green bloom toward the Mediterranean. Here, the river broke into many branches, weaving between swamps, marshes, and lagoons. The air was humid, the soil rich, and the people lived amid an abundance of fish, birds, and reeds. Their settlements were less confined, spread across a labyrinth of waterways that connected them to the wider world beyond the Nile's mouth. Though united by the river, these two regions developed distinct identities. The people of Upper Egypt wore clothing of lighter linen, often dyed in earthy tones, and built their homes from mud brick on high ground to escape the floods. In the delta, reeds and wood were plentiful, and homes were lighter, raised on platforms to withstand the moisture. The differences went beyond material; they were cultural, spiritual, and symbolic. Each region developed its own gods, emblems, and crowns. Upper Egypt honored the vulture goddess Nekbet, protector of the southern lands, and wore the tall, white Hedjit crown. Lower Egypt revered the cobra goddess Wadjet, guardian of the delta, and wore the red Dishret crown. These symbols represented more than political power. They embodied the spirit of the land itself. The two crowns, white and red, would one day be joined, but in this early time, they stood as banners of distinct realms, each proud of its heritage and divine protection. The boundary between them was not a sharp line but a shifting frontier marked by trade, influence, and occasional conflict. Along the river, merchants from both regions met to exchange goods, grain, pottery, ivory, copper, and gold. Over generations, competition for control of these resources intensified. Power gradually concentrated into fewer hands, as ambitious rulers sought to extend their authority beyond their own regions. In Upper Egypt, one center began to dominate. Hierakonpolis, already ancient by this time, grew into a powerful kingdom. Its rulers commanded loyalty from neighboring settlements and developed systems of administration to manage labor, irrigation, and trade. In the north, rival centers such as Buto and Sais held influence across the delta. What had once been a network of local chieftains was now transforming into proto-states, early forms of organized government that foreshadowed the bureaucratic might of later dynasties. The process of unification was gradual, not the act of a single conqueror but the culmination of centuries of social and economic evolution. Yet, Egyptian tradition would later remember this transformation as the work of one man, a hero, a founder, a king whose name echoed through myth and history, Narmer, sometimes called Menes. Before Narmer, other rulers had tried to extend their power across both regions. Archaeologists have found artifacts bearing the names of kings such as Scorpion and Ka, leaders of late pre-dynastic Upper Egypt whose authority may have reached into the north. These names, carved on small ivory tags and stone vessels, reveal that the idea of a united Egypt was already taking shape in the minds of early rulers. Among the most revealing discoveries are the ceremonial palettes, carved stones depicting scenes of ritual and conquest. These were not everyday tools but symbols of authority, used in temples and sacred ceremonies. The most famous of all, the Narmer palette, captures in stone the moment Egypt's duality became unity. On one side, the king, wearing the tall white crown of Upper Egypt, strikes down a kneeling enemy, a gesture of domination but also of order imposed upon chaos. On the reverse, he appears wearing the red crown of Lower Egypt, marching in triumph before rows of fallen foes. Between these scenes runs a procession of banners, gods, and symbols, an artistic manifesto declaring, "The two lands are one." The artistry of the Narmer palette is as remarkable as its message. The figures are arranged with precision and grace, following conventions that would define Egyptian art for 3 millennia. The king stands larger than all others, not because of perspective but because of significance. He embodies the divine authority that unites heaven and earth, man and God, Upper and Lower Egypt. To the Egyptians, this was not merely a political event but a cosmic one. The unification of the two lands mirrored the creation of the world itself, the triumph of order, Marat, over chaos, Isfet. The king's role was not only to rule but to maintain this balance, to keep the universe steady as the Nile kept the land alive. In later ages, this idea of duality, of two halves forming a perfect whole, would become the central symbol of Egyptian identity. The titles of the pharaohs reflected it: Lord of the Two Lands, King of Upper and Lower Egypt. The very word for the nation, Ta'i, meant the two lands. From that moment onward, Egypt was conceived as a union of opposites: desert and river, north and south, life and death, bound together by divine order. The unification was not achieved through endless war but through consolidation, diplomacy, and the shared benefits of stability. Once unified, Egypt's strength lay in its balance. The Nile continued to nourish both regions. Trade expanded across the deserts and seas, and a centralized administration began to emerge, managing irrigation, harvests, and taxation. The foundation of the Egyptian state, one of the earliest true nations in human history, had been laid. Yet, even in unification, the Egyptians never forgot the individuality of the two lands. Their art, ritual, and language continued to honor the duality. Every temple, every royal inscription, paired the two crowns, the two goddesses, the two halves of the country, always side by side, never one above the other. Egypt's unity was not the erasure of difference, but its harmony. In this delicate balance of opposites, Egypt found its identity, an identity that would endure for over 3,000 years. The story of unification did not end with the symbolic act carved on the Narmer palette. It was only the beginning of a long effort to weave a people, a landscape, and a belief system into a single fabric. What followed was the slow establishment of institutions that would preserve Egypt's unity for millennia: law, administration, religion, and art, all organized around a single, guiding principle: order. In the newly formed kingdom, the seat of power settled near the place where Upper and Lower Egypt met, a region that would later be called Memphis. It stood on the edge of the delta, where the narrow valley widened into open marshland, a position that allowed the king to reach both north and south with equal ease. Memphis became more than a capital. It was a symbol of balance, the meeting point of the two lands, and, in Egyptian thought, the heart of the world. Here, the first kings of the first dynasty began to formalize the machinery of government. Officials oversaw the collection of grain and livestock, the regulation of canals and dikes, the maintenance of temples, and the distribution of labor. Clay seal impressions bearing royal names show that goods were stored and taxed under state supervision. For the first time in history, a centralized administration managed an entire nation. The king, or Nisibiti, was not viewed as a mere ruler but as the living embodiment of divine order. He stood at the axis between gods and humans, a priestly monarch whose duty was to maintain Ma'at throughout the two lands. His authority was both political and spiritual. He commanded armies, yes, but he also led festivals, made offerings to the gods, and ensured that temples functioned properly. In him, the Egyptians saw the river's constancy, the sun's daily rebirth, and the promise that life would continue in balance. This divine kingship did not emerge from tyranny but from faith. The Egyptians believed that their prosperity depended upon harmony with the cosmic forces around them. Just as the Nile's flood had to arrive in its season, so too did justice, ritual, and governance need to follow the correct rhythm. A just king ensured fertile fields. A corrupt one threatened famine. Rule, morality, and nature were intertwined. The unification also brought about a flowering of artistic and symbolic expression. The twin crowns of the pharaoh, the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt, were often shown joined together as the skent, the double crown. It was a visual shorthand for the king's dominion over the two lands, but also for the deeper idea that harmony came from the coexistence of opposites. The duality echoed everywhere. In the paired goddesses Nekbet and Wadjet, in the twin titles of the monarch, and in the layout of temples where opposing forces were reconciled within sacred space. From the newly unified state arose a distinctive visual language that would persist unchanged for 3,000 years. Art became formalized, regulated by proportion, posture, and scale. The king was always shown larger than his subjects, the gods larger still. Scenes of victory, offering, or ceremony followed precise arrangements, not to record literal events but to assert the ideal of order. The world, in Egyptian eyes, was not depicted as it appeared but as it should appear. Religion likewise evolved from local cults into a structured pantheon reflecting national unity. The sun god Ra rose in prominence, worshipped as the divine father of kings. The concept of the afterlife became more defined. The deceased, like the pharaoh, could hope to join the eternal cycle of rebirth. Temples dedicated to local deities were now connected through royal patronage, each part of a network that extended from the Delta to the First Cataract. The priesthood became a learned class, keeping records, observing the stars, and advising the throne. To sustain such complexity, the Egyptians developed systems of measurement, writing, and administration that would make their civilization one of the most stable in history. Early hieroglyphs, first used for labels and accounting, soon evolved into a full script capable of recording names, prayers, and decrees. Each sign was both picture and word, sound and symbol. Writing gave permanence to the king's commands and sanctity to his rituals. Through the written word, Ma'at could be fixed in stone. The economy of the two lands thrived. The state coordinated irrigation projects that turned more desert into farmland. Surplus grain was stored in royal granaries, ensuring security during years of poor flood. Skilled laborers worked in organized teams to build tombs, workshops, and shrines. Trade flourished along the river and beyond Egypt's borders, to Nubia in the south for gold and ivory, to Sinai for copper and turquoise, and across the Mediterranean for timber and precious resins. Egypt's unity allowed it to project both wealth and stability, qualities that impressed its neighbors and deterred would-be invaders. Yet the Egyptians never viewed their prosperity as purely human achievement. Every success was an act of balance, a continuation of the cosmic order first established at creation. Festivals celebrated the renewal of this harmony, the flooding of the Nile, the rising of the star Sirius that heralded the inundation, the annual Sed festival in which the king ritually rejuvenated his power. Each rite reaffirmed the connection between the pharaoh, the people, and the gods. The distinction between Upper and Lower Egypt did not disappear. Rather, it became the dynamic that sustained the nation's identity. In official inscriptions, the pharaoh always addressed both regions. He who unites the two lands, Lord of the two crowns. The titles reminded all Egyptians that unity required continuous care. Just as the river's flood returned each year, so too did the act of unification need to be renewed through ritual, administration, and faith. By the end of the First Dynasty, Egypt had achieved what no other culture of the time could claim: a stable, centralized kingdom stretching nearly 700 miles from the Mediterranean to the Nubian border. The capital at Memphis linked the fertile delta with the resource-rich south. Communication flowed effortlessly along the Nile. Regional governors, known later as nomarchs, administered local affairs on behalf of the crown. The bureaucracy kept meticulous accounts of land, labor, and produce, ensuring that the pharaoh's authority reached every corner of the land. In this harmony of geography and governance lay Egypt's genius. The same river that joined north and south also carried the decrees of kings, the prayers of priests, and the goods of merchants. The Nile was both highway and lifeline, the physical manifestation of unity. Even time itself was measured by its behavior. When the river rose, the people rejoiced. When it fell, they harvested. When it lay quiet, they rested and prepared. The king's rule mirrored this rhythm, steady, predictable, and enduring. Through unification, Egypt discovered the principle that would define its civilization: endurance through balance. The two lands, once distinct, now existed in perpetual dialogue, each reflecting and sustaining the other. From their meeting was born a vision of the world as ordered, harmonious, and eternal. It was this vision that would guide the architects of the pyramids, the scribes of the temples, and the poets who carved hymns into stone. The union of Upper and Lower Egypt was not only a political milestone. It was the spiritual awakening of a people who had learned to see unity in diversity, eternity in change, and divinity in the rhythm of the earth. From this moment onward, Egypt would walk a singular path: its eyes fixed on the stars, its feet grounded in the fertile soil of the Nile, its heart forever beating with the pulse of the two lands. The unification of Egypt was not an ending but the beginning of a long, delicate process of cultural consolidation. A kingdom that stretched from the Mediterranean to Nubia could not be maintained by conquest alone. It required shared identity, one built on ritual, language, and belief. The first dynasties understood this well. Their rule was less about invention and more about refinement, the shaping of inherited traditions into a coherent national story. Through art, ceremony, and governance, they turned the memory of unification into a living symbol that would endure for 3,000 years. The rulers of the first and second dynasties, roughly 3100 to 2686 BCE, worked to define what it meant to be king of Egypt. They drew from the imagery of earlier pre-dynastic chieftains, rulers who had claimed power through strength, and transformed it into a spiritual office. The king was no longer a warlord. He was a cosmic intermediary, the guarantor of balance. His authority rested not simply on arms but on the belief that he maintained Ma'at across the two lands. To express this unity, royal titulary developed into a formalized system of names and titles. Every pharaoh carried the two ladies' name, invoking the twin goddesses Nekbet and Wadjet, protectors of Upper and Lower Egypt. His Horus name linked him to the falcon god, the symbol of divine kingship, while his Neti name identified him as the ruler who balanced north and south. These titles were not decoration. They were theology in words, proclaiming that Egypt itself existed through the presence of its king. In the royal tombs at Abydos, simple, rectangular mastabas of mud brick, the bodies of these early kings were interred with vessels of wine, tools, and food, accompanied by servants and animals to attend them in the next world. Each burial site represented both political power and religious devotion. As in life, so in death. The king continued to ensure the prosperity of the two lands from beyond the grave. As the institutions of the state matured, artistic and cultural conventions spread throughout Egypt. Pottery styles that once varied by region became standardized. Building techniques improved, leading to the first experiments with stone architecture. Inscriptions using hieroglyphic signs multiplied, recording not only royal names but offerings, festivals, and administrative details. The same visual language that appeared on the Narmer palette now decorated temple walls and ritual objects across the kingdom, uniting artisans under a single canon of form and meaning. The spread of literacy and iconography played a vital role in cementing unity. Hieroglyphs were more than a means of communication. They were a sacred art, each symbol a bridge between the material and the divine. A bird, a ripple, a reed. These were not abstract marks but living representations of the world. To write was to participate in creation itself, to reaffirm the order that bound heaven and earth. In this way, language became an instrument of national cohesion. The same symbols that described the king's name also recorded the farmer's offering and the priest's prayer. Trade, too, helped weave the kingdom together. Caravans carried copper and turquoise from Sinai, gold from Nubia, and fine stone from quarries along the Nile. In return, Egypt sent grain, linen, and finished goods north into the Levant. The Nile, acting as the great connector, ensured that no part of the country was ever truly isolated. The people of the Delta and those of the Southern Valley might live in different landscapes, but they were bound by the same river, the same festivals, and the same monarch whose image watched over them from stele and temple walls. Religion absorbed the memory of division and turned it into a theology of balance. The pairing of gods, sun and moon, sky and earth, life and death, became central to Egyptian belief. The very act of creation, as described in later texts, was understood as the separation of opposites. light from darkness, water from air, male from female. Egypt's own geography mirrored this cosmic pattern. The north and south, though distinct, completed each other. The two lands were not adversaries but reflections of a universal principle. That harmony arises from the meeting of contrasts. This idea found expression in every corner of Egyptian life. The royal regalia, the architecture of temples, even the language itself carried echoes of duality. Words for north and south, day and night, life and death, were paired in formulaic repetition. Rituals performed in one part of the country were mirrored by corresponding ceremonies in the other. Each temple contained twin shrines honoring complementary deities, their coexistence symbolizing the unity of the cosmos. The pharaoh's annual journey across the kingdom embodied this philosophy in motion. Traveling by boat along the Nile, he stopped at major towns to inspect temples, judge disputes, and perform sacrifices. His voyage mirrored the river's flow, a living ritual of connection. When the king appeared before his people, it was not merely a political act. It was a reenactment of creation itself, a reminder that Egypt remained whole only through balance. By the close of the Second Dynasty, Egypt had achieved a remarkable degree of stability. The basic institutions of pharaonic government were in place: taxation, record-keeping, organized labor, and a standing army. More importantly, a shared cultural identity had taken root. The farmer in the Delta and the craftsman in Thebes could look to the same myths, the same festivals, the same ruler, and see themselves as part of a greater whole. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals the first large-scale royal building projects, precursors to the stone monuments that would soon define the Old Kingdom. Temples dedicated to Horus, Hathor, and other deities were constructed with careful alignment to the sun and stars. Calendars marked the heliacal rising of Sirius, which announced the coming flood. The state's coordination of agriculture and labor around this celestial rhythm demonstrated an extraordinary unity of science, religion, and governance. Meanwhile, artistic conventions reached maturity. Relief carvings from tombs show boats gliding across calm waters, herds of cattle led by attendants, and processions of offerings brought to shrines. These scenes, serene and timeless, reveal a civilization that valued order above chaos, permanence above novelty. The world was depicted not as it changed but as it should endure, a world in balance, sustained by Ma'at. The kings of the early dynasties were careful to root their legitimacy in this order. They commissioned stele inscribed with their victories and offerings, but their language was rarely boastful. Instead, it emphasized restoration, renewal, and continuity. The ruler did not claim to conquer but to maintain. This tone of modest divinity would set Egyptian kingship apart from that of later empires, where rulers often sought personal glory. In Egypt, the highest virtue was steadiness. As centuries passed, the memory of Egypt's unification became a myth repeated in festivals, hymns, and royal rituals. The annual Sed festival, performed after 30 years of a pharaoh's reign, symbolized the renewal of his power and the reaffirmation of unity. The king ran a ceremonial course, wearing first the crown of Upper Egypt, then that of Lower Egypt, reenacting the eternal marriage of the two lands. Through repetition, the act of unification became timeless, no longer an event in history but a state of being. This concept of duality, of harmony through opposition, became Egypt's philosophical core. It shaped how the people viewed nature, society, and even death. The afterlife itself was envisioned as a balanced mirror of the earthly realm. Fields of reeds reflecting the fields along the Nile, the west mirroring the east, the setting sun balanced by its rising. To live rightly was to live in alignment with this pattern, to keep one's heart as light as the feather of Ma'at. The unity of the two lands thus transcended geography. It became the rhythm of Egyptian thought, the pulse behind every temple hymn and royal decree. When later generations built pyramids and carved colossal statues, they did so not only to honor their kings, but to sustain the harmony first established when Narmer joined the white and red crowns. The symbol of the double crown endured as the eternal reminder that Egypt's strength lay in balance, in the meeting of north and south, earth and sky, life and death. From this harmony emerged a civilization so stable that it would outlast empires yet to be born. Its people would change little over the centuries, not out of stagnation but from confidence in the rightness of their world. The pattern set in these early dynasties would guide every pharaoh who followed. They ruled a land that was, by design, two and one at the same time, diverse yet unified, temporal yet eternal. The two lands were no longer rivals divided by distance or culture. They had become a single idea, the embodiment of Ma'at on earth. Through their unity, the Egyptians believed they had achieved something divine, the transformation of a fragile world into a reflection of cosmic order. And from that unity, the civilization of the pharaohs would rise, its temples radiant in the sunlight, its tombs eternal in the desert, its story carried forever by the unbroken flow of the Nile. When Narmer united the two lands and placed upon his head the twin crowns of Egypt, he did more than conquer a country. He founded an idea. The idea that the ruler was not merely human, but a bridge between heaven and earth, a living embodiment of divine order. From this idea sprang the age of the first pharaohs, and with them the civilization that would define human grandeur for millennia. The earliest kings of the first dynasty, beginning around 3100 BCE, ruled from the newly founded capital of Memphis. The city stood at the seam between Upper and Lower Egypt, where the narrow valley of the Nile widened into the delta, a place both symbolic and practical, embodying the balance between the two lands. From here, the pharaohs could command the length of the river, oversee trade routes, and maintain the delicate unity of their young kingdom. These first pharaohs were not remote figures hidden in palaces. They were organizers, builders, and visionaries who turned a collection of regional powers into a coherent state. Through them, Egypt entered recorded history. The invention of writing, hieroglyphic script, allowed decrees, inventories, and royal achievements to be inscribed on clay and stone, ensuring that the king's words would echo long after his death. The earliest rulers, Narmer, Jur, Den, and their successors, established the traditions that all later dynasties would follow. They built tombs at Abydos and Saqqara, marking their eternal presence in both Upper and Lower Egypt. Each tomb was not merely a resting place, but a statement of philosophy, that life and death, like the two lands, were one continuous journey. The tomb was the home of the Ka, the vital essence that survived after death. To nourish the spirit, offerings of food, drink, and incense were placed regularly in chapels built near the royal burials. The architecture of these early tombs was humble compared to the colossal monuments that would later dominate the horizon. Constructed from mud brick and timber, they nonetheless revealed an evolving understanding of permanence. The structures, known as mastabas, from the Arabic word for bench, were flat-roofed, rectangular tombs with sloping sides. Within, chambers were lined with fine wooden panels, carved to imitate palace walls. The message was clear. The king would continue to rule in death as in life. Alongside these royal tombs were the graves of attendants and servants, buried near their masters. Some were likely sacrificed to serve the king in the next world, a grim but devout expression of loyalty. Later dynasties would abandon this practice, replacing it with symbolic servants carved in stone, the Shabti figures that would populate Egyptian tombs for centuries. But in these first generations, the bond between ruler and people was absolute, reaching beyond the threshold of mortality. The early pharaohs understood the power of symbolism. Their regalia, crowns, scepters, and ceremonial beards proclaimed divine authority. The white and red crowns represented the unity of the two lands. The crook and flail symbolized the shepherd's care and the farmer's discipline. The uraeus, a golden cobra worn on the brow, signified protection and the power to strike down enemies. Every aspect of their appearance was deliberate, a visual language that conveyed majesty and sacred duty. Under these kings, Egypt's political structure grew increasingly sophisticated. Officials known as viziers oversaw the administration, ensuring that the king's commands reached every province. Scribes recorded harvests, land surveys, and taxation on rolls of papyrus. Local governors maintained irrigation canals and organized labor for state projects. The bureaucracy that would define Egyptian government for thousands of years had begun. Despite this growing complexity, the heart of Egyptian life remained agricultural. Each year, as the Nile flooded, farmers rejoiced and prayed. The pharaoh was seen as the one who ensured the river's timely rise, a belief that tied his legitimacy to the health of the land. Should the floods fail or famine strike, it was the king's duty to restore Ma'at, the balance between nature and divine will. In this way, kingship became both a political office and a sacred covenant. The religious life of early Egypt mirrored this integration of the earthly and the eternal. Temples began to emerge as centers of worship and administration. The most important among them was dedicated to Ptah, the god of creation and craftsmanship, whose cult thrived in Memphis. Ptah was said to have spoken the world into existence through thought and word, a fitting patron for a civilization whose identity would rest on written language and monumental art. At Abydos, the cult of Osiris, the god of the afterlife and resurrection, took shape. The story of Osiris, though still evolving in this early period, spoke of a divine king murdered by his brother Seth and resurrected through the love of his wife, Isis. It was a tale that mirrored the Egyptian experience of death and renewal, flood and harvest, loss and rebirth. The pharaoh, seen as the living Horus, son of Osiris, became the embodiment of this cosmic cycle. When he died, he joined Osiris in the realm of the dead. His successor, the new king, became Horus in his stead. This fusion of theology and monarchy gave Egypt an unshakable foundation. To obey the king was to obey the gods. To serve the state was to serve eternity. The pharaoh's duties were not limited to governance. He was the high priest of every temple, the judge of every law, the guarantor of every flood. He was, in the eyes of his people, the living axis of the universe. As generations passed, Egypt's unity deepened. The descendants of Narmer maintained order and extended their influence south into Nubia and east into the Sinai. Expeditions brought back copper, gold, and turquoise. Trade routes carried Egyptian goods as far as Canaan. The prosperity of the Nile Valley, carefully managed by the state, made Egypt a beacon of stability in a world of shifting tribes and fragile city-states. The kings of the early dynasties left behind few written records of personal character, yet their legacy speaks through their achievements. They transformed a landscape of villages into a kingdom of enduring order. They established the principle that the divine and the human could coexist in a single figure, a principle that would shape every pharaoh who followed. Theirs was a world still modest in scale, but already timeless in vision. The tombs of Abydos and Saqqara, their walls carved with the earliest hieroglyphs, stand as whispers of a promise yet to be fulfilled, the promise of eternity made manifest in stone. From these beginnings, the dream of Egypt would rise higher and reach further than ever before. The early dynasties had built the foundations of Egypt's divine kingship, but it was in the Old Kingdom, beginning around 2686 BCE, that the pharaohs transformed belief into monument. Stone replaced mud brick, eternity replaced impermanence, and the landscape of the Nile Valley was remade into a mirror of heaven. Egypt entered its first golden age, an era of art, order, and ambition unequaled in the ancient world. The Old Kingdom began with the Third Dynasty, when a brilliant ruler named Djoser ascended the throne. Under his reign, Egypt's capital at Memphis became the center of administration, trade, and religion. Djoser was more than a king. He was the visible link between gods and men, charged with maintaining Ma'at across the two lands. His reign was marked by stability, prosperity, and one extraordinary innovation that would define Egypt forever: the creation of the first pyramid. Djoser's chief architect and high priest, Imhotep, was a man of genius whose name would echo through history. Unlike earlier royal tombs of mud brick, Imhotep conceived of a monument built entirely in stone, a structure that would not merely house the dead, but proclaim the immortality of kingship itself. At Saqqara, overlooking the capital, he designed the step pyramid, rising in 6 great terraces toward the sky. Each step symbolized an ascent from earth to heaven, a staircase for the king's soul to join the gods. The step pyramid complex was more than a tomb. It was an architectural statement of theology. Surrounding it were courtyards, shrines, and chapels representing the temples of all Egypt, united in miniature around the resting place of the king. The enclosure walls, built of finely carved limestone, mimicked the pattern of woven reed mats, echoes of the earliest dwellings now immortalized in stone. Even in innovation, Egypt remembered its past. This masterpiece marked the birth of monumental architecture. For the first time, humans had shaped stone not merely for shelter or defense, but for eternity. The message was unmistakable. As long as the pyramid endured, so too would Egypt and the divine order embodied in its king. Djoser's successors embraced his vision. Over the next century, pharaohs transformed the desert plateau west of the Nile into a sacred landscape of stone. Each king sought to build a pyramid greater than the last, a structure not of vanity but of spiritual symbolism. The pyramid represented the primeval mound that rose from the waters of chaos at creation, the place where the sun first shone. Its shape mirrored the slanting rays of the rising sun, linking the pharaoh with the eternal cycle of day and night, life and death. By the Fourth Dynasty, this ambition reached its zenith. The kings Sneferu, Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure turned the Giza Plateau into a city of immortality. Sneferu experimented tirelessly, building at Midam, Dashur, and finally the Red Pyramid, the first true smooth-sided pyramid. Each attempt refined the balance between engineering and symbolism, between the weight of stone and the weight of meaning. Then came Khufu, builder of the Great Pyramid of Giza, the largest and most perfect monument of the ancient world. Rising nearly 150 meters above the desert floor, its sides align precisely with the cardinal points, and its base forms an almost perfect square. Built from more than 2 million blocks of limestone, each weighing several tons, the pyramid required an organizational feat unmatched until modern times. Yet to the Egyptians, its greatness was not measured in labor or stone, but in purpose. The pyramid was the pharaoh's resurrection machine, his eternal staircase to the heavens. Nearby, Khufu's son Khafre built his own pyramid, slightly smaller but still majestic, guarded by the colossal Great Sphinx, a creature with the body of a lion and the head of a king. Carved directly from the bedrock, the Sphinx faced the rising sun, embodying royal strength and divine vigilance. Its calm expression, worn by millennia of wind and sand, remains one of the most haunting images of the ancient world, a face both human and eternal. These monuments were not isolated tombs but parts of a vast cosmic design. Each pyramid complex included temples for daily offerings, causeways linking them to the river, and subsidiary tombs for queens and nobles. Priests tended these sanctuaries long after the kings had turned to dust, ensuring that the rituals of renewal never ceased. The pyramids thus functioned as engines of continuity, spiritual and administrative centers that reinforced Egypt's unity. The art and inscriptions of the Old Kingdom reflect a confidence that borders on serenity. Wall reliefs and tombs show orderly processions of workers, scribes, and priests performing their duties with quiet precision. Scenes of harvest, fishing, and craftsmanship depict not struggle but harmony. Even animals are rendered in poised, balanced compositions. Everything obeys the same law of proportion, the same invisible rhythm that governed the cosmos. To the Egyptians, beauty was truth and truth was order. In the royal ideology of this age, the pharaoh became fully divine. He was not merely chosen by the gods but born of them. His soul, or Ka, was eternal. His physical body, though mortal, served as a vessel for the divine spirit. When he died, he ascended to join Ra in the solar bark that sailed across the sky by day and through the underworld by night. The pyramid was his gateway to the sun, a beacon to guide his rebirth. This divine kingship was expressed not through cruelty or extravagance but through ritualized harmony. The king was the high priest of every temple, responsible for maintaining Ma'at through offerings and ceremonies. He alone could present the gods with the Ma'at figurine, a small image of a seated goddess holding the feather of truth, symbolizing that he upheld balance in the universe. His actions were cosmic, not personal. Through him, Egypt remained aligned with creation. It is tempting to imagine the building of the pyramids as an act of oppression, but evidence tells a different story. The laborers who raised these monuments were not slaves dragged from foreign lands, but Egyptian farmers working during the flood season, when their fields lay underwater. They lived in organized workers' villages near the pyramid sites, receiving food, housing, and medical care. Their work was service to the gods, a communal offering of devotion. In this shared labor, the Egyptian sense of unity found physical expression. Every block raised, every tool carved, was part of a collective affirmation of faith. The pyramids were as much the work of the people as of the kings they honored. In their symmetry and scale, they expressed not tyranny but consensus, a civilization acting in harmony with its beliefs. By the end of the Fourth Dynasty, the cult of the sun god Ra had become the central focus of Egyptian religion. The pharaoh was now called the son of Ra, his reign an earthly reflection of the sun's journey. Solar temples rose on the west bank of the Nile, open to the sky, where priests performed rituals to renew the sun's strength. This theology linked kingship directly to the cosmos. As Ra rose and set, so too did the pharaoh die and be reborn. The daily rituals of the temples, the precise alignments of pyramids, and the mathematical perfection of architecture all expressed a single truth, that the world was an ordered whole, governed by divine regularity. To maintain this order was the greatest duty of king and people alike. The Egyptians had turned religion into geometry, and geometry into faith. The achievements of the first pharaohs reached far beyond stone and sand. They created the blueprint for Egyptian civilization, a centralized state, a unified religion, and an aesthetic of eternal calm. Their monuments stood as physical metaphors for their worldview, a faith in permanence, balance, and the sanctity of harmony. Even as centuries passed and dynasties changed, the ideals forged in the Old Kingdom never faded. Later kings would look back on this time as the age of the gods, the perfect model of Ma'at. In truth, it was the moment when humanity learned to think in eternity's language, to build not just for life but for forever. From the low banks of the Nile rose mountains of stone, and from mortal rulers emerged the first reflections of the divine. Egypt had found its voice, and it spoke in silence, the silence of pyramids, of sunrise over desert sands, of faith made everlasting through form. As the fourth dynasty gave way to the fifth and sixth, the essence of kingship that had been cast in stone at Giza evolved into something even more intricate. The pharaohs of this later Old Kingdom inherited monuments that touched the sky, but they turned their gaze inward, to the heavens of the spirit, to the hidden architecture of the soul. The physical pyramid remained the throne of eternity, yet within its passages, a new kind of immortality began to take shape, the immortality of the word. By the middle of the 25th century BCE, the cult of the sun god Ra dominated Egypt's religion. The kings of the fifth dynasty, beginning with Userkaf, called themselves sons of Ra and built temples dedicated to the solar deity at Abu Sur. These sun temples, open-air sanctuaries aligned with the setting sun, replaced some of the emphasis once given to the pyramid itself. They were architectural hymns to light, spaces where priests could perform daily rituals to ensure the sun's eternal rebirth. The pyramids of this dynasty were smaller than those of Khufu or Khafre, but their interiors marked a revolution. For the first time, the inner chambers were inscribed with pyramid texts, sacred writings carved into the limestone walls, prayers and spells meant to guide the king's spirit through the afterlife. Here, in lines of hieroglyphs, one hears Egypt's most ancient theology finding voice. These texts describe the pharaoh's soul ascending to the heavens, joining the imperishable stars, and sitting beside Ra in his solar bark. They are poetry as much as liturgy, solemn, rhythmic invocations that reveal the Egyptians' profound understanding of eternity. The king is not simply departing this world. He is transforming into part of the cosmic order. The pyramid texts are the earliest known religious writings in human history, and they mark the moment when the Egyptian quest for immortality became inseparable from the written word. The fifth dynasty also witnessed a subtle shift in balance between divine and human realms. The growing priesthood of Ra gained influence as temples multiplied and rituals became more elaborate. The pharaoh remained divine, but his divinity was now expressed through the service of the gods rather than as a god above them. The temples, staffed by educated priests and administrators, became centers of learning, astronomy, and record-keeping, the seeds of Egypt's future intellectual culture. Under the sixth dynasty, Egypt reached a new level of administrative sophistication. Kings such as Teti, Pepi I, and Pepi II presided over a network of officials, scribes, and provincial governors. The bureaucracy, already intricate, now extended into every corner of the kingdom. Records of taxation, labor, and harvest filled archives. The state's precision reflected its faith in order, Marat made manifest in papyrus and seal. Art and literature flourished under royal patronage. Tomb walls in the cemeteries of Saqqara and Giza were decorated with scenes of daily life, carved in exquisite detail. These images, farmers plowing, craftsmen at work, dancers performing at feasts, were not simple decoration but an affirmation of continuity. The afterlife mirrored earthly life, perfected and eternal. To depict a man plowing was to ensure that he would always plow, that life itself would not cease. Among the most remarkable of these tombs is that of Ti, a nobleman who served under several pharaohs. His tomb's reliefs show a world of order and abundance, where nature and humanity coexist in harmony. Even the chaotic scenes, hippopotamus hunts, fishing expeditions, are contained within perfect composition. The Egyptians had achieved not just artistic mastery but philosophical serenity. The conviction that chaos could always be measured, balanced, and transformed into beauty. Yet beneath this calm, subtle changes stirred. The long reign of Pepi II, who ruled for over 90 years, strained the mechanisms of governance. As generations passed, power slowly shifted from the royal court to local officials, whose tombs grew in size and splendor, rivaling those of the kings themselves. The vast machine of the Old Kingdom, once unified under divine kingship, began to fracture under its own weight. By the close of the 6th dynasty, Egypt faced a convergence of crises. The Nile's floods became erratic, bringing years of drought and famine. Provincial governors, or nomarchs, asserted independence, raising local armies to protect their regions. The central authority that had once embodied Ma'at faltered. Without the unifying presence of a strong pharaoh, the delicate balance between the two lands wavered. Yet even in decline, the Old Kingdom's ideals endured. Inscriptions from this period still praise Ma'at, still urge fairness, humility, and faith in the eternal cycle. The people did not abandon their gods. Rather, the gods seemed to retreat into silence, waiting for balance to be restored. What followed, the First Intermediate Period, was an age of transition, when Egypt learned that even divine order must sometimes pass through darkness to be renewed. Though the great age of pyramid building waned, the spirit that had raised them never died. The institutions forged by the first pharaohs, the bureaucracy, the priesthood, the art, and above all, the belief in the king as the embodiment of cosmic harmony, remained the backbone of Egyptian civilization for centuries to come. When later dynasties rose, they looked back to the Old Kingdom not as a distant past but as a sacred model, the era when gods had walked among men. The writings carved into pyramid walls evolved into the coffin texts of the Middle Kingdom and later the Book of the Dead, spreading the promise of eternal life from kings to commoners. What had once been the privilege of pharaohs became the hope of all Egyptians, that through knowledge, virtue, and the recitation of sacred words, the soul could triumph over death. The architecture, too, cast a long shadow. The precise geometry of the pyramids inspired later temples, obelisks, and tombs. Even when the Egyptians abandoned pyramid construction, they retained its symbolism, the union of earth and sky, the journey toward the sun. The pyramid form became the blueprint for sacred space, an unspoken dialogue between human effort and divine perfection. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the first pharaohs was psychological. The creation of an identity that saw stability not as stagnation but as wisdom. In a world of shifting empires and collapsing kingdoms, Egypt endured because it understood that permanence was not the absence of change but the mastery of it. The river might rise and fall, dynasties might bloom and fade, but Ma'at, the eternal balance, remained. In this understanding, Egypt achieved a kind of immortality more profound than any monument. The stones of the pyramids may crumble, the names of kings may fade, but the idea they embodied, the harmony between humanity, nature, and the divine, still resonates across time. When the ancient priests read the pyramid texts by the flicker of torchlight, they were not simply speaking to their dead kings. They were reminding themselves, and all who would come after, that life and death were part of a single continuum, that every rising sun was a promise renewed. In their chants, one hears not mourning but assurance. You have not gone away dead, you have gone away alive. You go to the sky among the stars. The doors of the sky open for you. You join the company of Ra. Thus ended the age of the first pharaohs, not in collapse but in transformation. The pyramids they left behind still hold their vigil over the desert, eternal in purpose if not untouched by time. They are Egypt's first great conversation with eternity, a dialogue begun 5,000 years ago and still ongoing, carried on by wind and sand and human wonder. The Old Kingdom closed, but the civilization it had forged did not die. It simply exhaled, paused, and prepared for renewal. In the centuries that followed, Egypt would face division, rediscovery, and rebirth. Yet through every change, the lessons of its first pharaohs would endure. That harmony is the truest form of strength, and that from order, even death becomes another kind of life. The story of Egypt's birth is, in the end, the story of the Nile. Every temple, every tomb, every stone raised toward the sun began with that single, steady river that breathed life into the desert. Long before kings or pyramids, the Nile taught its people rhythm, patience, and balance. It taught them that creation is not an act of force but of harmony, that endurance is born not from conquest, but from alignment with the eternal pulse of nature. As Egypt's civilization grew, so too did its understanding of what it meant to live within that rhythm. Across thousands of years, from the first farmers to the last pharaohs, one truth remained constant. The river's gift was not merely water, but meaning. It showed that existence itself could be sacred, that the ordinary, the rising of the sun, the flooding of the fields, the turning of the seasons, was a reflection of the divine order. To the Egyptians, the Nile was a living chronicle. Its floods marked the years. Its banks held the layers of their history. Every generation left its trace in the silt, the remains of dwellings, shards of pottery, fragments of ritual and song. The river carried the memory of them all, washing the past into the present with each returning tide. When the priests of later dynasties looked upon the Nile at dawn, they saw not just a river but a timeline flowing backward into eternity. The waters that touched their hands were the same that had touched Narmer's fleet, the same that had mirrored Djoser's pyramid, the same that had reflected the shadow of Khufu's colossal monument. In its constancy, the Nile was Egypt's first and greatest historian. Unlike human memory, which fades and distorts, the river remembered everything through renewal. It taught the Egyptians that loss was not an ending, only a transformation. The flood that destroyed also nourished. The death that ended one life made room for another. This cycle, witnessed each year, became the foundation of their faith. Life and death, the seen and the unseen, were not opposites. They were the same current moving in different directions. Egypt's greatest creation was not its art or architecture, but its philosophy, the idea of Ma'at. This principle of balance governed not just the cosmos, but the conduct of every person. Ma'at was truth, justice, harmony, and rightness. It was the invisible thread that tied heaven and earth, the law that kept the stars on their paths and the Nile on its course. For the pharaohs, ruling in accordance with Ma'at was their highest duty. But Ma'at was not only for kings. In humble villages, in workshops and fields, ordinary people sought to live by it too. Tomb inscriptions of scribes, craftsmen, and farmers often read, "I did what was right. I fed the hungry. I gave water to the thirsty. I spoke the truth. I was one who walked in Ma'at." To live rightly was to align oneself with the eternal flow, to be in harmony with the river of existence itself. This moral philosophy, simple, quiet, and profound, was Egypt's true legacy to the world. It offered a vision of order without oppression, faith without fanaticism, and eternity without fear. The Egyptians did not long for salvation. They sought balance. Their afterlife was not escape, but continuation. To be judged by the gods was to have one's heart weighed against the feather of Ma'at. Light if one had lived in truth, heavy if one had lived in deceit. The ideal was not perfection, but equilibrium. Through the millennia, Egypt spoke in a language of symbols. The lotus flower opening at dawn, the scarab beetle rolling the sun across the sky, the falcon soaring above the desert. All these images formed a vocabulary of eternity. To modern eyes, they may seem decorative, but to the Egyptians they were living hieroglyphs, each a vessel of divine meaning. Hieroglyphic writing itself was an act of faith. Every sign was a prayer, every word a bridge between worlds. The Egyptians believed that writing preserved life. To inscribe a name was to give it permanence. That is why they carved so deeply into stone, why their monuments still speak across 5,000 years. For them, words were not symbols of memory, they were memory. Even in the smallest artifacts, the Egyptians sought to capture the eternal. A painted amulet, a carved scarab, a humble offering bowl, all bore the same quiet purpose: to keep life moving forward, to ensure that nothing good was ever lost. They believed that what is spoken or written endures, that what is remembered remains real. The Egyptians' reverence for the past did not trap them in nostalgia. It grounded them in stability. Each generation built upon the work of the last, not to outshine it, but to preserve and refine it. Their civilization did not depend on novelty, but on continuity. In this way, the Nile's lesson flowed into their culture. Progress as patience, change as rhythm. Modern minds often measure greatness by innovation, but Egypt measured it by endurance. Their greatest pride was not that they had created new wonders, but that their way of life had lasted unbroken for centuries. To them, eternity was not an abstract idea, it was a practical goal. They achieved it not through conquest, but through constancy. The farmers who tended the same fields year after year, the priests who performed the same rituals at the same hours, the scribes who copied the same hymns, all were participants in a single grand act of preservation. Every repetition was a prayer, every act of care a contribution to the eternal order. Theirs was a civilization that found holiness in habit. It is easy to speak of kings and pyramids, but Egypt's true strength lay in its people, the millions of anonymous men and women who lived quietly along the riverbanks. They rose with the dawn, labored under the sun, and slept beneath the same stars that watched over the pharaohs. Their lives were simple, yet deeply connected to the cycles that shaped their world. They knew the Nile's moods, the soft hiss of its rising waters, the glitter of its flood at sunset, the scent of wet earth as the waters withdrew. They built canals and levees, baked bread from the silt's grain, and carved homes from mud brick that cooled in the desert wind. In their daily rhythms, they embodied the wisdom of balance far more perfectly than the greatest of kings. Their devotion kept Egypt alive long after dynasties rose and fell. To them, the river was both parent and companion, a patient teacher that never spoke but always instructed. They learned generosity from its floods, resilience from its droughts, and humility from its vastness. To live beside the Nile was to accept one's place in the order of things, to know that life flowed not for the strong or the clever, but for those who adapted with grace. Even today, standing on the banks of the Nile at twilight, one can feel that same ancient stillness. The air is heavy with warmth. The water glows like molten glass beneath the sinking sun. In that moment, time seems to dissolve. The river that drifts past Cairo or Luxor is the same that carried the boats of Khufu and Hatshepsut, the same that mirrored the temples of Karnak and Abu Simbel. The sound is the oldest voice on earth. The monuments that line its banks are not ruins but reminders. They whisper that civilizations rise and fall, but the search for harmony endures. The Egyptians did not fear death because they understood that death was part of life's current. They saw eternity not as something far away, but as something present in every heartbeat, every sunrise, every returning flood. When the Nile flooded, the people rejoiced, not because it was new, but because it was familiar. In its predictability, they found comfort; in its repetition, faith. Their lives were woven into a pattern so vast and so enduring that even now, it feels less like history than a dream that never ended. The legacy of Egypt is not confined to its monuments. It lives in the human desire for meaning and continuity. The Egyptians remind us that greatness need not come from conquest or invention. It can come from reverence, from the careful tending of what already exists. They found eternity in patience, in gratitude, in the steady labor of hands that knew their work would outlive them. In their wisdom, the Nile was not merely a river, it was a mirror. It reflected the heavens, but it also reflected humanity. It taught that balance is not something to be achieved once, but something to be renewed every day. Its slow, unhurried flow is a lesson in humility, a reminder that the grandest creations begin in quiet persistence. Today, the pyramids still stand, their outlines softened by sand and time, yet their meaning remains clear. They are the echoes of a civilization that understood how to live within the rhythm of the earth. The people who built them are gone, but their faith that life is continuous, that order can triumph over chaos, still flows like the river that gave them birth. The Nile remains, as it always has been, the unbroken thread through Egypt's story. It has seen the rise of gods and the fall of empires, yet its waters continue to move, indifferent and benevolent. It carries silt from distant lands and memories from forgotten ages. It nourishes fields where children play beside the same reeds that once hid the infant Moses, where fishermen cast nets as they did in the time of Kafir. To stand beside it is to stand outside of time. The air smells of wet clay and life. The horizon shimmers with the promise of continuity. Every ripple on the surface seems to whisper the same ancient assurance, that nothing truly ends, that everything flows forward, transformed but enduring. As the night settles over the desert and the river glows beneath the stars, Egypt's story comes full circle. It began with water and ends with it. The Nile, constant yet ever-changing, remains the truest symbol of the civilization it shaped, quiet, enduring, and eternal. The pharaohs are gone, their names carved in forgotten tongues, yet their vision endures in the silence of the pyramids, in the rhythm of the river, and in the heartbeat of humanity's longing for order amid chaos. Egypt's gift to the world was not merely art or architecture. It was wisdom, the understanding that to live well is to live in harmony with time itself. The Nile flows still, carrying with it the dreams of kings and the prayers of farmers, the silt of the past and the promise of renewal. It teaches, as it always has, that eternity is not somewhere beyond the horizon. It is here, in the steady movement of water, in the endless rhythm of life that began before memory and will continue long after we are gone. And as long as the river flows, the story of Egypt will never end. The river quiets now. Its waters shimmer beneath the moon, carrying the faint reflection of stars that have watched over Egypt for 5,000 years. The voices of kings and workers, of priests and scribes, have faded into the silence of the sand, but the rhythm they followed endures. It hums softly in the current, in the wind that drifts over the desert, in the heartbeat of the earth itself. This has been the story of the Nile, of the land it shaped, the people it sustained, and the dream of eternity it inspired. From the first farmers who waited for the flood to the pharaohs who built their stairways to the sun, each generation added its note to the same endless song. They taught us that balance is strength, that order is beauty, and that life, when lived in harmony, never truly ends. So as the night deepens and the world grows still, imagine the river's calm flow. Let its steady movement carry away the noise of the day. Picture the glow of a distant temple torch, the rustle of papyrus in the breeze, the quiet breath of the desert. The Nile continues on, ancient, patient, eternal, just as time itself flows forward, unbroken. And as you drift toward rest, remember, the story of Egypt is the story of us all, of how humanity learned to listen to the earth, to build with reverence, and to find peace in the rhythm of the world. Sleep well, traveler through time. The river keeps its watch.